Thanks everyone for joining. Today I'm going to have a conversation with Wendy Mathis about unit forecasting. So just to introduce myself a little bit, my name's Zach Fisher. I'm Director of Data Science here at Kapoq, and something we've been trying to do more of recently is share our experiences working and building alongside some of the best brands and agencies in the Amazon community. And so that's why I'm happy to be sitting down with Wendy Mathis from Channel Key. Wendy, how are you today?
I'm great, Zach. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Of course, happy to have you. Wendy has a tremendous amount of retail experience, both in brick and mortar and e-commerce. And today we're going to be talking about demand planning and forecasting for your business, which is a particularly challenging problem for e-commerce sellers using FBA. I know Wendy can relate to that, and I'm sure we'll be unpacking a lot around that. But Wendy, before we jump into unit forecasting, why don't you share a bit of your experience as it relates to today's conversation?
Yeah, so thanks. That was a good intro to begin with. And you're kind because you didn't tell how many years I've been doing it. But I have been almost for 30 years been doing and working around in the retail space. And I started as a buyer. So I think we call them buyer, merchants, planners. That's where I started my career, and really how I built my agency, True Hero, was around this planning, forecasting, bottoms up piece. And then we were just acquired in January by Channel Key, who's the best, and they were already working with Kapoq and doing a lot of this. So we're just adding on to that expertise. So this has been something that I've been doing for a really long time, but I'm pretty passionate about.
Awesome. Yeah, that's a great intro. And so maybe let's just jump in. One thing maybe to start off with, Wendy, I know sometimes we'll talk about trend forecasts, strategic forecasts. Do you maybe want to explain what's meant by those terms? Maybe any thoughts you have around those too?
Yeah, I'm sure we'll have very similar answers to that question. But so a trend forecast from my perspective and my experience is we're really just looking at what has been happening. So we can look backwards and say, okay, the last 4 weeks or 6 weeks, and you always want to define what that trend is. Am I looking at the last trailing 12 months, weeks, days, whatever that may be? But it's really just whatever's happening, we're just going to predict is going to continue to happen in the future. Now, if you have been in retail for 5 minutes, you know that is probably not going to be the case. And so we're going to need to adjust it. And that's what I would like to call a strategic forecast. And then we start making changes. Like, what if the ASP was different? What if the average selling price is going to change? What if there was an inventory, like we were out of stock on something, or there's a promotional shift? Whatever the case may be that happens in retail, the weather could have shifted and you have snowshoes, right? So there's a lot of different things that have happened or that are going to happen. What October, the last 4 weeks of October are not going to be what the next 4 weeks in November look like. And then, obviously for trend forecast, we can look at last year and we can look at and anticipate what we're going to see. But really that strategic forecast to me is really digging in and looking at it ideally at a SKU, ASIN, UPC level and really determining what is going to happen based on all the things that have happened. But a trend forecast is a great way to start. It's a good base.
I was going to say base too, so you stole that from me. I think and maybe it's a base, but the base isn't good enough. I might add that disclaimer of, I think a lot of tools out there will give you a trend forecast, which is that base, but then you need to have those conversations of what's going to be different in the future, which no tool is going to be able to know all of that. You need to have conversations, expertise, know what's going to change. And so that's where the strategic forecast comes in. Yeah, if we're going to change prices, that's obviously going to impact things. And so that's just one of the 100 different things that are going to take it from a trend to a strategic forecast. And so that's why I like when I'm partnering with people with the unit forecasting tool I'll listen to, okay, what can we capture? And then what are the discussions that we need to have to take it to the next level to make it as accurate as possible? And then sometimes unforeseen things happen where the next year, as time goes by, things can change where you might have a case where your product reviews could get better or worse, you could have inventory problems, and all these things can happen where you have this perfect plan, but you need to adjust it and frequently revisit these forecasts. You're able to refine it and make sure that you're doing the work to get that back on track. So one question I wanted to ask you, Wendy, I was curious is how often do you look at forecasts to basically reforecast? And also how many months do you tend to look ahead? And maybe it can vary because I know you look at a ton of different burnout. So.
Yeah, it does, especially when you're working with, and it also varies on how we're working with a client. So if it's my brand, when I was in a buyer role, we're always looking out 6 to 12 months, right? Because we're in the process of buying 6 to 12 months out. I come from apparel and footwear, so it's a ton of SKUs, and so we're constantly looking out that 6 to 12 months. But every month we're realigning on forecast. So I feel very bullish about that. And then during key months, like we're recording this in Q4. So right now we're looking at that weekly, especially if we have a client that's an FBA or an FBM, we want to make sure that we're replanning weekly if needed or if we need to, but really a monthly forecast. So I think one of the things that's a little bit of a misconception within our industry, whether that's e-com or brick and mortar, just retail in general, is I did my forecast 6 months ago. And so now that's there. And that's great, but like every month. And you know what? It's really amazing. We get smarter the closer we are. We're super smart. Like my forecast for December is going to be way better today than it was when I did it in June. And so I do the monthly forecast, and we actually, as an agency, we sit down with our clients if that's part of our SOW with our clients, and we sit down with them monthly and align on that. And what we want them to be able to do is take that buy and go to factory with it. We want it to be that good that they can go to factory. So we are looking out that depending on what their own lead time is. But for an apparel brand, that's 6 to 12 months out.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. I love that you revisit it weekly. I feel like a lot of people would be impressed by that frequency. And I think that's a testament to like how much you care about forecasting, how much work you've put into making it an easy process. Because part of it is, do you have a strong process for doing this? Or is it so frustrating? There's so much data that you need to pull, maybe very slow spreadsheets. Sometimes I've seen where it's such a cumbersome process, and maybe you don't have a great tool that you like really hate revisiting it, and it can be, oh, I did it 6 months ago. That's not frequent enough. I think you said that perfectly. I say you want to look at it at least every month. Did anything change substantially? And then if you're able to do it weekly, like that is awesome. Because I think even if you're just doing a high level, are certain things way off what's going on there? Because you can really get into any trends and make adjustments quickly, as opposed to not reviewing things frequently enough and then not being able to act quickly because of that.
Yeah, the problem is that so we charge our brand management team and our planning team to look at that, like they're looking at an ASAP, an at-once order weekly for most clients. Again, like this is very client specific, but for most clients, they're going to look at that on a weekly basis. If they don't, and then we don't get to react to it, now we've missed sales.
Exactly.
And so if we wait for monthly for sure, if it maybe every other week, it really depends on the brand, and it depends on their lead time and then what kind of inventory we know they're holding. Fashion brands, we got to look at it close. On something that's like a replen, then it's a little bit easier because we anticipate them having stock.
Yeah, no, I think that's a perfect answer, and it definitely does relate to lead time, and there's no just one perfect number. But if you're not doing less than your lead time, then you're probably going to get yourself into some trouble. Yeah. Okay, great. Then the next thing that I wanted to shift to, I know you have strong thoughts on this one, Wendy. So demand transfer, I think let's talk a little bit about that. And we also just passed like Turkey 5 Cyber Monday, so that's interesting too. But I know you have thoughts on demand transfer, that not working on Amazon. Do you maybe want to talk a little bit about that, and then maybe how that relates to unit forecasting?
Yeah, this is an ongoing frustrating battle with e-com. So from brick and mortar, because not everybody does e-com, I think most people that are listening are probably doing e-com, but on a brick and mortar, it is a little bit easy. First of all, defining what a demand transfer is. So if I have a black bike, this is the bike I have. If I'm out of stock on that and I have blue in the exact same size, but it's blue, I'm asking for the demand to transfer to blue. That's a demand transfer, just to make sure that we're talking apples to apples here. So in the store, if the customer only gets to see blue, they're more likely to buy the blue bike. Whereas on Amazon, they're seeing all of it, right? So they can see all the competitors and they can see what was there before, because Amazon's still showing the black bike, right? Like you go walk into a brick and mortar, the black bike's gone. It's out of stock. There's no black bike. But on Amazon, it's going to show it to you for weeks. And Amazon's going to try to order it for months or not years. And we're out of stock on it, but they're still surfacing. It's really hard to get the customer to say, okay, fine, I'll buy the blue from you. If they really want a black bike, they're going to go buy that black bike from your competitor or for somebody else, or they're going to try to find it on brick and mortar, or they're going to go Google shop it, right? The problem is with Amazon is that we don't see that one for one. I get more frustrated with, it's more the client wants to see that. Oh, just put more advertising to it. If you just drive it, and like, it's not how Amazon surfaces the product. So if the black has always been number one, they could be out of black for months and it still is going to be the product that surfaces, and that's really hard to change over to the blue. And I'm just using that as an example, but then it's really hard to get the customer to even know that there's a blue option, and all they see is that it's black's out.
No, I think you hit a lot of the points that I was thinking of too. I actually went Black Friday shopping, and I was thinking of you, Wendy, because I went into a brick and mortar store and they didn't have exactly what I wanted, but I was like, I'm already here and I like did all this work. Okay, I'll grab the most similar thing. And then tying into the bike example, you might buy the blue bike, and then you might also be in that brick and mortar store, and then you might get a helmet, you might get some shoes, all these things. And then if you're instead on Amazon, you may have not only not sold that bike, but then you may also, you're not able to capture that full package too. So it can be pretty punishing. There's a lot of competition on Amazon. And brick and mortar, like they can really pull you into getting other add-on products as well. And if you just miss that one color, you have an inventory problem, then you could just be totally out of everything. So it's a different ballgame altogether, really.
That's a really good point, like the add-on sale and like where you can miss that. And then they're spending so much time trying to shop your competitor or shop something else that you've lost them completely. So I think that's important. What we see though from how we do demand transfers or how we're trying to forecast. So the reality of it is some people will buy the blue bike, right? So there is going to be that. And so there is this point in time that as a planner, we have to make a decision on, okay, if we're going to be out of, and we're forecasting, like we are anticipating being out of black bike by March 1st. So now we're not going to make any more of the factories out of black paint, whatever the case may be. Now we have to say, are we going to buy more blue? And we need to have a real understanding of, because there is that customer who still needs that 20-inch bike. So they're going to buy a blue bike because they trust Amazon, they trust the brands, they've already had it surfaced. They're like, whatever, my kid's 10 years old, he can ride a blue bike, he'll be fine. Whatever the case may be, there will be some of that, but it's not going to be a one for one. And so that's when you really are starting to dig into how much blue am I selling versus the black? What will my conversion be? Am I going to have to increase my, how much, at what point does increasing the marketing not help anymore? It's just like a lost cause. So I think like we do have to take it into consideration because there will be some conversion. It's just most likely not going to be a one for one. And we have to be really careful about that because then we just overstock ourselves.
Yeah, it's definitely very likely going to be less than 1-to-1, but the question is what percentage is it? And that's a challenging question. And there's going to be no perfect answer. Like bikes might be different from clothes. It's going to be a discussion that you have to have and that's where the strategic forecast really comes into play, is making those adjustments for what's appropriate given your experience with the brand. But that can be a challenging one. And that actually ties into kind of the next thing that I wanted to bring up. So you're out of stock of the black bike. I wanted to talk about, there are all these adjustments that you can make in forecasting, including lost sales due to out of stock. And I could talk about that for a long time. Maybe Wendy will just kick off with your thoughts.
I'm just gonna say, then you should have hired a channel key, and then we would have solved for that. I think that this is the thing that when we bring on a client that we notice the most if they haven't had a strategic forecast. We'll see it, and it's a win for us as a company, honestly, to say, here's how much we think that you have lost. And those are guesses, right? Because we can see on the 1P side, on the Vendor Central side, we can see how many times it's ordered, but that's duplication. We're going to guess based on conversion, right? We can look at what their ruse is, like their replen out of stock. There's all these kind of metrics within Amazon to say what happened. The question is, first of all, it's worse on Amazon than it is in brick and mortar, right? Because for a brick and mortar, it's this peg space or this like slot, and they can either fill it in with something else, or, and again, it's a demand transfer, which we already talked about. And it's also like for a limited period of time, because then that customer comes back in 2 weeks and they see it again. The problem is with on Amazon, not only does the customer not see it, now it's brought down, right? So like you've been out of stock for a few days, like weeks, you are in trouble on the algorithm, right? So now it's pushed you all the way down. Then it costs you a ton of money to bring it back up from an advertising standpoint. Somebody's now winning on those keywords. There are so many elements, so many variables when we go out of stock that it's not just, oh, whatever, we just were out of stock for a couple of weeks. That is super costly. It's not just like the 2 weeks that you're out of stocks. It's the 4 weeks that it's going to take for you to come back up to that and surface and start getting that demand and conversion.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. Yeah, it's
It stresses me. I can't stand it.
yeah, no, I hear you. It's not just that you lost the sales. There's all these other impacts as well. And that kind of actually relates to my next question of I think it is unlikely if you have, let's say, a certain amount of lost sales historically that you're going to be able to fully recapture those lost sales going forward. Let's say you had $1 million of lost sales or whatever it is. I think it's very unlikely that you're going to hit that perfect world where you have no lost sales due to out of stock. Not only is there because of you're going to hit roadblocks in the future, run out of stock on certain SKUs, it's just going to happen. But then also all of the other factors that you mentioned as well, that there's really this ripple effect that's very hard to recover from. So I was wondering, Wendy, like if there's a certain amount of lost sales historically, do you have a way that you adjust the forecast for that? Because you don't want to fully adjust it. So there's maybe some percentage or some partial adjustment. I know that's a tough question, but I'm curious if you've thought about it.
Yeah, for sure. So obviously, yes, it goes back to, I don't know that you can never get back to the $1 million. I think it's really hard. I think it's very difficult. And it also really depends on what side of the platform you're sitting on. If we're talking about Amazon specifically, Vendor Central to Seller Central, like that bounce back is very different because what happens on the Vendor Central side. So the short answer is I don't have a percentage because it really depends. It depends on, you know what, if I have a very well-known high demand brands, I'm going to bounce a lot faster than if I have a ton of competition and and I don't own the market share. Like a brand that owns the market share and it's a top product, I'm going to claw my way back. I've lost a ton of sales. I'm not going to say if I lost $1 million in sales, that doesn't mean I'm going to do 2 million in the next quarter, right? So I think you just have lost those sales. Now the question is, can I regain it to get back? It is very difficult. I don't know that it's impossible. It depends on the client and it depends on the product, in my opinion. The Vendor Central, the Seller Central side, and I'll just carry on with this because I think it's important to note that what happens in Amazon's demand forecast and their demand planning is that once that is out of stock and then the Amazon algorithm, the demand forecast is looking backward and they can't see that, now they have to do a manual input. And if you don't have a vendor manager or an AVS or a relationship with InStock or a relationship at all with your vendor, like that vendor team, you will never see that come back again. It is nearly impossible. You could try to put some born to run into it. You can try to play some games like to increase the demands, but that is going to be a manual input. And candidly, we saw this through COVID, right? So like in COVID, when when there was no inventory on certain categories, the demand forecast the planning system couldn't look backward and say, hey, we really think we need this. And so we worked endlessly with vendor manager and in-stock teams, ISMs, sorry, I said that and didn't define it, and ISM teams to get them to write manual orders. And it was not easy conversations. On the flip side, on Seller Central, you get to do that. You get to decide that. And so that's where I think that you can start clawing back a little sooner on brands and where there is that high demand on a client that doesn't have a ton of competition, that no one's come in and already taken it over, because that happens too. Depends on how fast, like a direct from China manufacturer, they're like, that's a hot item. You did $1 million last month. I'm going to come in and swipe it and I'm going to do that for you. And that's a whole other factor, right? On the Seller Central side, once you can get back into stock and really start putting some advertising, you can start getting a little bit closer to that. But I am going to take that into consideration on my strategic forecast, and I have to pay attention to that the next year when I have to anniversary that time period if that ASIN has lasted the 12 months. That was a lengthy answer, sorry.
No, it was a good one. And like when I asked you, we're going to talk about strategic forecast, like I knew it was gonna get there, and I completely agree. And so this is also a place where I think, just as you said, it's going to vary account by account, whether it's Seller Central or Vendor Central. And then obviously even amongst Seller Central accounts, it's going to vary quite a bit, very substantially, I would say. So that's why basically the way that we incorporate it in our tool at Kapoq as a strategic forecast is we'll pull by SKU your historical lost sales and then let you apply a percentage of that prospectively, and you can decide based on your knowledge what percent, like ultimately that's going to require the things Wendy was saying, your understanding of the account, the past, the future, what things are going to look like. There's not one perfect percentage that's going to work all the time. forecasting is complicated, but you can just plug whatever percentage you want in. I never would recommend close to 100% for most people, because that's just way too optimistic and it's tough. But you can put in some fraction of that depending on your strategic view of what the next year is going to look like.
Do you have a default, or do you have a default by category that you use in Kapoq?
We do have a default. So yeah, the default that we put in is 30%, and then you can move
That's
from
fair.
there. Yeah,
That's
which
fair,
we have.
yeah.
We had a lot of discussions internally about what is a fair number, and I think we've heard 20, 30. I think once you get a lot higher than 30, then it's ambitious, and people get ambitious with forecasts, but you also want to be realistic. You don't want to buy all this inventory, assume, oh, every lost sale I had last year is not going to happen. There's a lot of competition out there, and when reality hits, you're probably not going to be too far above that unless you have very special circumstances.
And it depends on how long you've been out of stock, right?
Exactly.
Right. And when you're out of stock and what you're coming into, right? What kind of time, the time of year that you're coming into. So there are a lot of factors. 30% sounds 20. I'm a little bit more aggressive, so I would probably say 20.
20, yeah.
But I'm an aggressive buyer. Like I'm always overbought.
Really
it's good.
varies.
I like it. No, I think it's good. It's a good number.
And benchmarks are tough, so I'm glad you asked that, because I'm like, I asked you a benchmark already of like how frequently should you revisit and refresh, and every question there's no perfect answer, but it's always interesting to hear what other people are doing.
I always want to be 100%, but that's not realistic, right? We're always trying to get as close as we possibly can. And Zach and I actually had this conversation prior. I think that a good trend forecast, if all the elements are in there, you should be able to get to a 70% accuracy. Right. And honestly, there's a lot of, not even talking about agencies, there's a lot of brands that don't even do that part of it. And so 70% is better than what they were doing if they do nothing. Right. So again, it's a good base. If it's a accurate number, like if all the data is good, because garbage in, garbage out, then a 70% base is pretty good. Right. Like you're not going to really get too hurt overall. You might have an item here or there that you're like, you blew it on, but for the most part, it's pretty good. I'm going to try to strive, and like my goal and to my team, to my planning team, is like, you got to be 90-95% accurate, because we're talking about telling a client in one of their most strategic key accounts, this is what we think Amazon's going to buy from you. Or that's on the 1P side. On the 3P side, what we think customers, this is the sales we think you're going to do. And then they're like, again, like we want them to have confidence in our numbers and start making like big buying decisions. So if I don't do this at an ASIN, UPC, SKU level, depending on who you are and how you look at it, if I don't do that at that level, then I'm just like, you bought 20,000 too many units on that one, but I was like 90% on everything else. Like now they're just sitting on this. And so I think it's very irresponsible to talk about being a planner and to deliver that if you're not doing a pure bottoms up plan. That doesn't mean we're going to be perfect. It really doesn't. There's zero way to be perfect, but I'm striving for 90%.
I would say I like what you were saying, Wendy. Of definitely something's better than nothing. Usually, maybe you're at 90 with a good trend forecasting tool, but you're going to need to spend some good time planning and understanding the strategic forecast component to squeeze out those last percentages, is how I think about it. All those lost sales adjustments. Are there new SKUs that you're introducing, for example? That's something that you would want to plan out, add that in. Tools can only go so far if they're looking at the past. So I think, to get that last 5-10%, that is meaning you're having a lot of good discussions with your team to make those strategic forecasts. Also, what I really like is when people will revisit their forecast, look where they went wrong and understand why they went wrong, so they can use that knowledge for the future. So it's really embedded in the thought process versus, I'm just going to do this infrequently and I don't know why I was off. You need to really get the pulse on why things could be different, so that percentage can get higher and higher over time.
So I want to add into that, because I think it's so important, this like really reviewing that forecast accuracy and having that discussion with the client. So we're agency, so if you are the client, then you're the client, but having the discussion, because often it's something that we may not know as the Amazon or Walmart agency. It may be, we went into Dick's Sporting Goods. You know what? That's going to affect things. And so we can be like, man, like we were really on track here and we really missed it. And then we get to have those discussions and it's like, okay, well, can you tell us what that assortment is? Do they have a different pricing model? Are you doing a different promotional strategy there? And we need to make adjustments based on those things. And those are outside factors, because Amazon does not sit in a tiny little corner in the mall. So all of those things really have to be taken into consideration, and we don't know what we don't know either. So I think having those conversations, not just with our internal team, but also with the brand themselves is essential.
I agree completely. Yeah, and it's always that's interesting to just hear like your benchmarks and how you think about that. I may shift over then into, we have a couple last items, a really interesting conversation so far. I wanted to just talk a little bit about how Kapoq's unit forecasting tool works. And then Wendy, once I've gone through that, I want to hear how Channel Key thinks about unit forecasting, maybe any additional pieces or comments that you have to enhance how we think about forecasting at Kapoq. But just walking through unit forecasting, and definitely reach out to me too if you want a demo or to understand our unit forecasting tool in more detail. But the basic idea with how we think about unit forecasting, I break it into two pieces. And so it's how many units are you going to sell over the next 12 months, and then also how is that going to be distributed across the 12 months? What kind of seasonality are you seeing? And then, like Wendy was saying, you want to look at that forecast by SKU by ASIN. You need a very granular analysis if you want to achieve those higher accuracy 90-95+ % forecasts. So we have the option where you can do a forecast by SKU or you can do a forecast by ASIN, and then we'll calculate basically what are your estimated sales over the upcoming 12 months. And so we'll compute basically a run rate of how many units we expect you to sell. So that's going to involve your historical data, the bumping up for lost sales that we talked about quite a bit here. We also incorporate returns. That could probably be a whole call, so I'll just maybe graze over that one, but that's another adjustment we didn't even really get into very much here. But there are all these adjustments you can make for pricing, growth. And so basically what we have is lost sales and return adjustments, and then so that all bubbles up into what is the number of units of sales that you expect over the next 12 months, and you can apply a growth rate factor on top of that. And so that's one piece is, okay, a SKU, maybe we're expecting to sell 1,000 units of the SKU for the next 12 months. Then we want to ask, how are those 1,000 units of sales going to be distributed across the year? Is this an account where we expect a lot of sales in November and December? Is it something, maybe it's Halloween costumes and maybe it's going to be higher in October? So it's just really going to depend on the account and what they sell. But so looking at what historical seasonality have you observed? And we have a bunch of different sales curves. We look at the last year of data, last 2 years, last 3 years. We'll build out what your seasonality looks like for data that you have by product category. There are many other ones too. You can actually just assume the same sales curve that the SKU had in the prior year. We're adding in the upcoming feature, I'll give a teaser, where we're rolling it up by parent ASIN, a sales curve by a parent ASIN's coming out soon. So lots of different sales curves that you can look at your seasonality through. And basically what we'll do is we'll give you the one that has the highest correlation with your historical sales by SKU. And so we actually do the math of looking at over all the possible sales curves and then assigning the one that has the highest correlation with your SKU, but we give you the ability to adjust. So that again ties back into the strategic forecast idea of we put in some baseline numbers, but you definitely want to take a look and then use your strategic forecast to make any additional adjustments. So just to summarize, we do it by SKU or by ASIN, and basically we are going to forecast the number of units of sales that we expect by SKU for the next 12 months, and then we'll break that down by month. So you also have a view of seasonality as well. So that's like the very high level, making me condense it into a few minutes, but there's so much that goes into it. And I'm sure Wendy could probably add a lot more, but those are key cornerstone pieces that we have. And then you can upload that forecast into Kapoq. It's going to speak to the rest of Kapoq, help you with inventory management and things like that. So that's the high level overview. Wendy, I might turn to you now if you have any comment, which I just talked for a long time. There's a lot to unpack there, but do you have anything to add regarding our tool or any additional things that Channel Key that you think about for unit forecasting that we haven't covered yet?
When we met a few months ago, I told you I wanted to break the system, right? I wanted to try to break what you guys were doing, and I haven't been able to do it. So kudos, because I try to break everything. I love, so the thing about Kapoq is that you guys do a really great, obviously you're getting the data directly from Amazon, so we trust the data to the level we trust Amazon, right? But that's all the data that we have, and that's how we're using the data. And honestly, I think Amazon's data is pretty accurate for the most part. I feel pretty confident in making those decisions. And I've been working with Amazon for 18 years. I've seen how it's developed and whatnot. So I love that it's all together. I love that I can trust the trend forecast. I love that I got to have an opportunity to pick your brain about how you created it. And so I feel really confident about being able to use the tool because I know the framework of how it was built, and it's very aligned with how I think. And I feel like I'm pretty good at this, right? Because I've been doing it for a long time. So I do think that it's really important that we do that strategic piece of that. And I think that Kapoq makes it easy to do that. Like, it's not something that's super clunky. And we've talked about different things and how we look at it, but I feel like we're able to make the adjustments that we need right there, and being able to, and certainly we can manually do it, but we can also globally do it. So if we have a category that we know this whole category is going to be up 10%, then we can flush it through 10% based on that trend forecast. And I think it just makes things a little bit easier, and it's definitely faster than just using an Excel spreadsheet. So that's nice. So I do appreciate that. I think the only thing that I would add on to it, and only because of how we work as an agency, is that we're looking at everything that we are talking about today is about demands, right? So it's about what customers are going to buy from Amazon. And so we actually will take that a step further for our clients, which I think is interesting. And just because I think it's interesting that we do this, but we'll say, okay, we think the customer's going to buy 100,000 units, but Amazon already has 20. Right, so that we're taking it down to the next level and saying, here's what we think the demand forecast is, and here's what we think the buy forecast is. And so I think it's important when, as an agency and how we're dealing with clients, that we're not going to just tell you what the customer is going to buy. We're going to tell you what we think Amazon's going to buy. And often that's one for one, but sometimes it's not, especially if we hit inventory positions and whatnot. And so that's an important piece of it, because if Amazon already owns a couple months of coverage, like weeks of coverage, which we haven't really talked about a ton about weeks of coverage, then we have to make that adjustment. If Amazon went from buying 6 to 8 weeks of coverage or vice versa, and now they're buying 3 to 4, that's going to adjust what we think the customer, like not what the customer's going to buy, but what Amazon's going to buy from the client. And I think that's an important thing to maybe just understand, that it doesn't just stop with what the customer's going to buy. It's also what is the client going to get from that, because that's what the number that they care about. Right? They care about their invoices. They care what Amazon's going to buy from them. And again, that's very 1P sided. I have a lot of, 1P background, but I think it's an interesting dynamic to the conversation. So.
Yeah, no, that's definitely a really important piece as well. And you have a lot of experience, so that's helpful to hear you involve that. Yeah. Cool. So I'll lead towards us wrapping up then. But before signing off though, 2025 is going to be here before we know it. And I didn't know, just Wendy, I know we've talked a lot about forecasting, but as the new year approaches and people hopefully have already made or finished their forecasts for next year, or made a lot of good progress, but I know there are many who are still working on some stuff. So do you have any tips to people as we move into 2025 for forecasting? Just final thoughts or anything we haven't touched on yet?
I would say don't hesitate on making adjustments right now. It's the biggest time of the year. It's the most traffic, and it can't just be, well, I already did it and it's already December, and we just said it, well, it's kind of late, I hope you've already done something. Your Q1 buy is probably done, but you need to make those adjustments based on what's happening right now and what kind of momentum you're going to get. If you had a really stellar Q4, what impacts can you make? Because you want to keep that halo effect. I think it's really important that we don't just say, well, it's December 4th, so 2025 is baked. Don't hesitate to make adjustments. I think it's really important.
I completely agree. My job's director of data science, so I always let the data do the speaking, right? So I can agree more of, if you have new data, can you use that to reforecast, to refine? That can make a huge difference. And we just passed Cyber Monday. Can you look at how the last week of sales have been? That's a really helpful data to look at and see, okay, based on that, how can I think about 2025? Do I want to make any tweaks because of what I saw? So great advice there. It's been an awesome conversation, Wendy. Thanks for taking the time. And so if anyone has any more questions about demand planning, then don't hesitate to reach out to either of us. And be sure to follow Kapoq so you don't miss out on future educational content. Maybe before the final sign off, Wendy, do you just want to briefly mention if someone wants to contact you, if you feel comfortable, what would be a good way to contact you?
Yeah, I'm really active on LinkedIn, so please reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm Wendy Mathis on LinkedIn, so I would love to hear from you.
Awesome. And I'm just Zach at Kapoq, Z-A-K, at kapoq.com. So if you want to learn more about unit forecasting, then definitely don't hesitate to reach out. We also have a Kapoq LinkedIn, as well as I have a LinkedIn.